This is Faith Ignited, the podcast where we put God back into history.
Episode 28, From Under the Rubble. It was strange how quickly a man's life could change. Aleksandr sat among the other prisoners in the overcrowded jail cell, stifling heat pressing in upon them, the smell of body odor almost as unbearable as the tension that gripped them. They had all been summoned for some unknown purpose, and as he clenched and unclenched his hands, Aleksandr silently pleaded, not to any god, for he felt sure there was no god, but to whatever cosmic forces were at work in the universe, that they had all been gathered to be informed of their release. Rumors had floated among the prisoners that a day of amnesty might be declared, and the only all-powerful being as far as Aleksandr was concerned was Joseph Stalin, and it was upon his mercy that he now had to depend. Aleksandr shook his head, wondering how it was possible that just months before, he'd been a captain in the Russian army, a highly decorated captain, mind you, recognized for exemplary service in his fight against the Germans. Then, in one great moment of devastation, it had all come crashing down, and it all began with that ill-conceived letter. How vividly he remembered that fateful day when he'd been called into Brigadier General Trovkin's office. When Aleksandr had entered, he'd noticed a group of officers standing in the corner of the room, most of whom he did not recognize. Trovkin sat behind a desk, watching Aleksandr with a cool, calculating expression. Without emotion, he'd said, "Hand me your revolver." Puzzled, Aleksandr reached for the weapon in his belt holster, obediently placing it in the hands of the commanding officer. He watched as the general wound the leather strap round and round the butt, before carefully placing it in his desk drawer. He folded his hands on the surface of the desk, saying in a low voice, "All right, you must go now." Confused, Aleksandr stood there awkwardly, silently, unsure what he meant. Yes, Trovkin repeated. "It is time for you to go somewhere." Suddenly, two officers stepped forward from the group in the corner. "You are under arrest," one of them announced. Baffled, Aleksandr gasped out, "Me? What for?" Without explanation, the two officers ripped the epaulets from his shoulders and the star from his cap. They tore away his belt and snatched the map case from his hands. Aleksandr's arms were seized as the men began hauling him out the door. "Wait a moment," he suddenly heard Trovkin call out. The two counterintelligence officers stopped, releasing their grip. Hoping Trovkin might say this was a horrible mistake, Aleksandr turned to face the Brigadier General. "Have you," Trovkin began, "a friend on the First Ukrainian Front?" Aleksandr felt the blood drain from his face. He knew instantly that the friend Trovkin referred to was Nikolai Vitkevich, his old companion from their school days. The accusation from the general instantly sparked outrage from the two arresting officers. "That's against regulations," they shouted at Aleksandr. "You have no right." Correspondence between officers and people at the front was strictly controlled by security services, personal letters being seen as suspicious. But Aleksandr knew that his arrest was likely tied to one piece of correspondence in particular. Resolution number 1. A political manifesto he and Nikolai had made when they'd crossed paths several months before. Both men were still confirmed Marxists, deeply committed to the communist revolution that Lenin had waged around the time of their births. But there was something else upon which the two young men agreed: that Joseph Stalin had gotten away from Lenin's vision for Russia. And they'd said as much in their resolution, daring to make several critical comments regarding the Soviet Union's current leader, signing their names to the document. As Aleksandr stood there, he realized now that the manifesto had been a piece of great childish stupidity. They knew that censorship was in place, and that their letters would be read, but that had not stopped them from making derogatory comments about Stalin, and he realized then, in dawning horror, that he was going to pay the price for his foolishness. Aleksandr was shaken from his reverie by the door of the cell opening. One of the men present was summoned, and the rest of the prisoners remained behind in anxious anticipation. Finally, the door opened again. One look at the man's face struck fear into their hearts. He looked utterly crestfallen, his expression glazed as he sat down, and another was summoned out the door. They crowded around him. "Well?" they demanded. 5 years, he answered numbly. Aleksandr took in several steadying breaths, still hoping that this man's fate might be the exception. Not long after, the second man returned. 15 years, he pronounced dejectedly. Alexander's stomach plummeted. There was no denying it now. They had not been brought here to be released. They had been brought to be sentenced. Aleksandr waited in agony for his turn. When he was finally ushered in, he stood stiffly before the black-haired NKVD major, barely breathing. By decision of the special board, the major began, "You are sentenced under Article 58 to 8 years of corrective labor camps. The sentence is final and not subject to appeal." Aleksandr barely heard him over the blood pounding in his ears. The number swam around his head. 8 years in the gulag. His mind flashed back to his carefree school days, when he'd caught glimpses of condemned men shoved into train cars, their bodies gaunt, their eyes sunken and haunted. Little had he known then that he'd been looking at a ghost of his own future. Aleksandr glanced down numbly at the document slid in front of him to sign. His hand trembled, partly from fear, partly from anger. He refused to sign anything until he had read the document through. It was straightforward enough. He was now a condemned man, with no rights and nowhere to turn. He glanced up, hoping for some further clarification, but the major wasn't about to offer it. The man looked around almost bored as he went through what was surely for him an everyday practice. He simply gestured for the next prisoner to be brought in. "But really," Aleksandr pleaded desperately, "this is terrible. 8 years? What for?" The major ignored his objections, pointing to where Aleksandr was expected to sign. "Right there." Defeated and deflated, Aleksandr reached forward and signed his name, mumbling about the injustice and his right to an appeal. "Let's move along," commanded the jailer impatiently, ushering him out of the room. As Aleksandr sat back down in the cell, surrounded by all the other condemned men, his mind almost refused to accept his fate. Was this really to be his sentence? The turning point of his life? Had he not just written to his wife Natalia a few months earlier, saying that his life was on a fixed course and nothing could derail it? How bitterly wrong he had been. Perhaps one of the most profound statements ever made by Jesus Christ was, "By their fruits ye shall know them." This counsel followed a warning he gave about false prophets, who would come in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they were ravening wolves. The benefit of studying history is that we now see the results of every cause, every ideology, and to know whether it's good or bad, we need only ask one question. What kind of fruit did it bear? I want you to keep this principle in mind as we dive into what might just be the most difficult topic I have undertaken thus far. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the ideology that shook the earth during the 20th century, that caused more deaths than both world wars combined, and has caused some of the greatest human suffering that ever transpired on this earth. In this episode, we will tackle the towering subject of communism and its mother philosophy, Marxism. I'm going to introduce you to Karl Marx and show you that his ideas have now spread nearly to every inch of our society, in ways you probably don't even realize. I will also tell you the story of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, who experienced firsthand the fruits of communism, and who found Christ during one of the darkest periods of history. If you were to take a time machine back to the 1960s, you would find that in America, there was a widespread fear, sometimes even paranoia, of communism, and specifically the Soviet Union. We call that period of time the Cold War, because America and the Soviet Union never engaged directly in a large-scale war. It was a war of ideas, and a battle to spread different ways of life. But why were these two nations so different? What even is communism, and why have we gone from fearing it to embracing it so much in America? In simple terms, communism is a political and economic ideology that works to create a classless society, and the state distributes all resources based on needs. So there's no private property, the government owns and controls everything, and distributes things equally, with all people sharing resources and made equal by the government. Now, equality, sharing of property, that doesn't sound like a bad thing. How does that lead to millions of people dying and losing human dignity? Let's dig a little deeper and expose the wolf under this sheep's clothing. Communism is a form of government that was based largely on theories developed by Karl Marx. Author and former FBI agent Cleon Skousen described Marx as, quote, one of the most dramatic personalities to cross the pages of history during the 19th century. As one who would have a greater impact dead than alive, biographers would grapple with the enigma of Marx's life. At one moment, Marx would be called the greatest genius of his age, and a moment later, even his disciples would feel forced to call him a violent, quarrelsome, contentious man, a dictator and a swashbuckler, one at feud with all the world and continually alarmed lest he should be unable to assert his superiority. Karl Marx was born in Treves, Germany, in 1818 to a Jewish family. He descended from a long line of scholars and rabbis. When he was 6 years old, Marx's father broke religious ties, joining a Protestant congregation, mostly for social reasons and the security of his legal practice. But some biographers point to this turmoil as one of the reasons that Marx would later completely reject religion. Marx was a bright student in elementary school, but he struggled to make friends, something he never would excel at due to his hot temper and competitive nature. He struggled to get along with his parents, who often complained of his egotism, his lack of consideration for the family, his constant demands for money, and not responding to most of their letters. He further shamed the family by joining a tavern club, getting deeply in debt, and nearly getting expelled for nocturnal drunkenness and riot. After getting injured in a duel, he ended up transferring to the University of Berlin. It was here that he began his intense study of philosophy. It was also during his university studies that he completely turned his back on religion. As author Dan Ellsworth explains, Marx has long been regarded as an atheist, but his poetry reveals that his worldview was not atheistic, it was misotheistic. In contrast with atheism, which is a lack of a belief in God, misotheism is a personal hatred of God. Marx viewed religion as the opium of the people, the drug that lulled society into submission. And when asked about his intentions, Marx is said to have responded, "My object in life is to dethrone God and destroy capitalism." His poems are replete with anti-Christian and anti-God sentiments, like, quote, "I wish to avenge myself against the one who rules above." Marx would claim that religion was merely a man-made construct to enslave mankind, and because there was no God to save humanity, Marx sought a way to save the world outside of religion. In his mind, mankind was the most intelligent of all the creations that science had produced, and in consequence had a duty to remake mankind, and that could only be done through the systems of power, or governments. His theory was that man's greatest instinct was self-preservation and self-interest. Thus, if we remove all competition by forcing mankind to be equal in means, then all the conflicts that had driven mankind apart before would cease to exist. If mankind has nothing to fight over, then they won't fight, basically. He was seeking to build a utopia. But before that would be a great revolution of blood, where mankind must be brought into submission, and have their freedoms systematically removed so a new economic system could be imposed. He acknowledged that it might come peaceably, assuming that people were willing to give up their property. But seeing that as unlikely, he anticipated that it must happen by force. Do you see how fundamentally different this is than the Christian worldview? Marx believed that by changing men's environment, you could remove the vices of mankind. Christianity is the complete opposite. Its goal is to remove human vices, and then they change their environment, willingly sharing their means with others. Both communism and Christianity strive toward the same end, which is a utopian-type society, but they have night and day methods of getting there. In 1847, Marx, and the one friend that he would keep through his life, Friedrich Engels, wrote out the Communist Manifesto, explaining to the world that communism stood for 1. The overthrow of capitalism, which, just for clarification purposes here, capitalism basically just means a free market, letting people compete in the economic space and letting people own private property, which is what we have in America. 2. The abolition of private property. 3. The elimination of the family as a social unit. This one often surprises people. They don't realize that Marx wrote anything about the family, but he viewed it, again, as just a social construct, and thus a way to control people. 4. The abolition of all classes. 5. The overthrow of all governments. And 6. The establishment of a communist order with a communal ownership of property in a classless, stateless society. And to accomplish this, Marx and Engels summarized, quote, "In short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite." I don't think people realize often the scope of Marx's intentions and what he really wanted to accomplish. We often associate him simply with economics, which, yes, Marx was obsessed with money, as much as he was with power, because for him it was the same thing. But Marx's end goal was a large-scale revolution, and ultimately a reshaping of the entire world to this communist way of life. And it's clear by Marx's own life that he rejected capitalism. He was unemployed when he and his wife were married, and that is how it was to be for most of their marriage. They were driven from different countries because of Marx's radical ideas and revolutionary rhetoric, finally making England their permanent home. While there, he and his family lived in the most severe poverty, in the worst part of London. As Skousen explains, a peculiar combination of emotions were expressed by Marx in his correspondence during this period. On the one hand, he expressed soulful concern for the welfare of his wife and children. He confessed in a letter to Engels that the nocturnal tears and lamentations of his wife were almost beyond endurance. Then in the same letter, he blithely went about explaining how he was spending his whole time studying history, politics, economics, and social problems so as to figure out the answers for all the problems of the world. As Otto Ruhl wrote in his biography of Marx, regular work bored him. Conventional occupation put him out of humor. Without a penny in his pocket and his shirt pawned, he surveyed the world with a lordly air. Throughout his life, he was hard up. He was ridiculously ineffectual in his endeavors to cope with the economic needs of his household and family, and his incapacity in monetary matters involved him in an endless series of struggles and catastrophes. He was always in debt. He was incessantly being dunned by creditors. Half his household goods were always at the pawn shop. His budget defied all attempts to set it in order. His bankruptcy was chronic. The thousands upon thousands which Engels handed him, Engels would constantly help support him financially, melted away in his fingers like snow. It is a bit ironic that somebody who struggled with money their entire life would end up becoming the father of an economic theory. But interestingly, Marx's ideas were not embraced in his time, and he alienated many of his friends and supporters because of his competitive and caustic nature. One biographer described him as egotistical to the pitch of insanity. Anyone who threatened Marx's leadership was summarily mowed down. Mikhail Bakunin, for example, the first Russian to become interested in revolutionary activities, became an avid supporter of Marx's. But when other members of the movement were drawn to Bakunin's leadership, Marx immediately set out to destroy his competition by accusing him of being an agent of the Russian Tsar, and of embezzling money, which ultimately got him removed from the International Workingmen's Association. Despite this, Bakunin would still be the instrument to carry Marx's ideologies into Russia. When Karl Marx died, he was a broken and dejected man, his work seeming to have come to nothing. Only about 11 people attended his funeral. When one reflects on the life of Karl Marx, it leaves a lot to be desired, which is why historians like to admire his ideas from a distance, because any contact with his person reveals something turbulent and tragic. But you can't separate the philosophy from the philosopher. Marxism, and ultimately communism, are a reflection of Marx himself. In the end, Marx never saw the bloody revolution that he called for. Nevertheless, that revolution would come, his ideas giving birth to some of the most turbulent events that the world has ever seen. Before the Soviet Union, Russia was ruled by a powerful Tsar, the last of whom was Nicholas II. Most people in the country were poor, and many workers lived in harsh conditions. In the late 1800s, new political ideas began spreading. Thinkers like Mikhail Bakunin helped introduce and spread revolutionary ideas, encouraging people to question and resist the government. Even though Bakunin and Marx disagreed on some points, their ideas inspired many Russians to believe that the system needed to change completely. That change came during World War I, when Russia faced heavy losses, hunger, and growing unrest. In 1917, protests broke out, leading to the February Revolution, which forced Nicholas II to abdicate his throne. A temporary government took over but failed to fix the country's problems. Into this chaos stepped Vladimir Lenin, who led a group called the Bolsheviks. Promising to solve the people's problems, he gained strong support. Later that year, his group seized power in the October Revolution of 1917, and it was in 1918 that Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn came into the world, the man destined to shake the Soviet Union with his voice. Thus, the USSR and Solzhenitsyn emerged almost at the same time, their fates inseparably connected. Taisia stared out the frost-rimmed window, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the cross at her throat. The small symbol was a comfort, a relic from the life she had known before her entire world had collapsed. Taisia shut her eyes as memories pressed in. Their estate, land, livestock, and fortune, all gone, ripped from them by the state. Cold resentment surged inside of her, bitter as the wind whipping outside. The new regime had labeled her entire family class enemies. And for what? Because her father had been industrious and owned land? Her father, Zakhar, had earned everything he'd ever owned. Originally from Ukraine, her father had started as a boy with nothing. But through hard work, he'd made something of himself, gaining the respect of those who worked for him by treating them fairly. But after the Bolsheviks had executed the entire Romanov family, the Tsar, his wife, and children, the new regime had systematically begun claiming all land and resources. Famine spread across Russia, streets ran with blood. But Taisia had suffered her own personal losses. Her husband had died in a hunting accident just before the revolution began, leaving her at 23, pregnant and alone to face this terrifying new world. Taisia heard the scuff of a footstep behind her and turned to see Aleksandr standing beside her in front of the window. He was growing so tall, so independent, something that filled her with wonder and fear. He had recently joined the junior wing of the Communist Party, and the thought made her feel ill. What were they teaching him there? She already knew the answer, the exact opposite of what he learned at home. Taisia had never hidden the truth about her beliefs from her son, though technically it was illegal to share religious faith, even with your own children. And she had never shielded him from the terrible events surrounding the revolution and the toll it had taken on their family. They spoke about it often in private with relatives, but still, she was beginning to wonder who had more sway on her son, family or the state. Taisia ran a hand over Aleksandr's dark hair, guiding him back to the stove to get warm. Their shack was always cold, drafts constantly creeping in through the walls. There was no running water and no indoor plumbing. Due to her privileged background, Taisia had struggled to find a good-paying job. The label of class enemy was enough to dissuade most employers, and it was impossible for her to secure anything but this small, overpriced hut for housing. Many in her position might have sought to remarry, but as she glanced over at Aleksandr, who had sat down in front of the stove, a book open in his lap, she knew that she could never risk marrying someone who might mistreat her son. Suddenly, a knock came at the door. Taisia froze, her heart thudding. No one came without reason anymore, and rarely for anything good. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, forcing herself forward, she opened the door, and her breath caught. Papa? Zakhar Sherbak lifted his head, offering a weak smile. She hardly recognized him. He seemed to have aged a great deal since she'd last seen him. His beard was more streaked with gray, his eyes dim. She quickly ushered him inside before the cold or watchful eyes could follow. Papa, she repeated, embracing her father. You should have written. Too much trouble for you, he replied, shrugging. I know the distance, and it's safer that no one know that I'm here. It's so good to see you, she said. How is Mother? She's faring well enough. Aleksandr greeted his grandfather with a hug as well. Did you come all the way from Georgievsk, grandfather? Zakhar nodded. Yes, they nearly kept me there again. They questioned you? Taisia asked with some concern. Zakhar sat down dejectedly in the corner. He pulled out his Bible, beginning to leaf through the pages. Of course, he said, with a humorless laugh. Always the same questions. Where's the gold? Where did you hide it? It's not enough that they took everything from me. They won't leave me alone. Won't believe that I have nothing else for them to take. Her father leaned back, his gaze wistful. The house is a school now, I think. Or perhaps offices. They never tell me. His eyes turned to Taisia. But it cannot last. It cannot. His voice grew firmer, almost defiant. These communists, this madness, it will pass. And when it does, his gaze turned back to his grandson. The estate must be ready. It must be kept properly for Sasha. Aleksandr heard his nickname and looked up intently at his grandfather. Seeming to want to comfort him, he said, Don't worry about it, Granddad. I don't want your estate anyway. Taisia stiffened. I would refuse it on principle, Aleksandr finished. For a moment, the room fell silent. Her father did not speak. His fingers stopped moving over the Bible pages, and he looked at his grandson intently, as if seeing the boy for the first time. There was sorrow in his eyes. He seemed to realize that there was something else the Soviet Union could take from him, something more valuable than even his property. Their education system had crept its way into his family and was laying claim to his grandchildren. Taisia observed the exchange with sadness. But what was she to do? Attendance was mandatory. If Aleksandr stopped going, questions would be asked, and the officials alerted. It seemed that she was losing her son, and there was nothing she could do about it. The next morning, Taisia was awoken by the sound of boots. They struck the door with a violent crash that shattered the fragile quiet of dawn. Taisia jerked up straight. Aleksandr stirred, blinking in confusion. Before she could reach the door, it burst open. 2 Soviet policemen in heavy coats strode into the room. "Zakhar," one of them barked. "Where is Zakhar?" Taisia's heart lurched. He isn't here," she said, rising to her feet. "He stepped out." She knew her father must have left early to attend church, but she purposely left out that detail, for it would only incriminate him further. She herself had stopped attending church every week for reasons of security. The men exchanged a glance. "We know why he's here," the man continued. "Gold. He's been hiding it. It belongs to the state." "We have no gold," Taisia said, her heart thudding wildly. The agent stepped closer, and she shrunk back. "Class enemy." He spat the name. "Lying will not help you," he said. "You will sign a statement declaring that there is no gold in this house. If we find any, you will be arrested immediately." Taisia's hands trembled as they pushed a paper toward her. They had nothing to hide, she reminded herself. Then a painful thought suddenly occurred to her. "Does that include wedding rings?" she asked. The agents glanced at each other and nodded. Slowly, Taisia slid the ring from her finger. She then went to the small box by the bed and took out the other ring as well. For a moment, she hesitated. It was one of the few reminders of her husband. Silently, she placed both of the rings into the waiting hand. At that moment, the door opened again. Her father stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. The agents turned on him instantly. "Where is the gold?" one shouted. But Zakhar did not answer. Instead, he walked calmly to the icon in the corner of the room. Then, ignoring the shouting men entirely, he knelt. His old knees struck the floor with a dull thud as he bowed his head and began to pray. The agents swore loudly and hauled him roughly to his feet, searching his coat, his pockets, even his boots. They found nothing. Furious, they shoved him aside and stormed toward the door. "We'll catch you yet, old man," one of them snarled. "Next time you won't be so lucky." The door slammed behind them. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Taisia looked down at her empty hand where the ring had been, and once again, she reached for the cross at her neck. The years following the murder of Tsar Nicholas II and his family have been the bloodiest in Russian history. It was the destiny of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn to live through most of them. As much as the Russian people suffered under the Tsars, it was nothing compared to the suffering that they would experience under the leaders raised up by the Soviet Union. Communism is a system for creating tyrants. Can I say that again? Communism is a system for creating tyrants. That's apparent from history, because it happens everywhere it's implemented. The 74 years that Russia would be a communist state, the country would pass from the hands of one dictator to the next. All of them had several things in common. First, they were atheists who did not believe in God or God's laws. The fact that they rejected God and God's laws accounts for the crimes that they committed. When someone adopts a Marxist ideology, they gain a new moral compass. In their minds, anything that forwards communism and its mission is moral. Anything that disrupts that mission is evil, which is why political enemies were treated worse in Russia than actual criminals. But that being said, not every person who was in favor of communism was or is a bad person. On the contrary, people are often drawn to this ideology because they want equality. They want to end poverty. And many were absolutely blindsided by the monster that they created. After the communist state took hold in Russia, several things quickly happened. Vladimir Lenin ordered all property to be seized from major landowners. The Cheka, a secret police force, was organized to snuff out all enemies of the state. This period following the revolution is known as the Red Terror. Part of this was a large-scale deconstruction of the Russian Orthodox Church, which up to this point had been deeply entrenched in Russian culture and society. Monasteries were converted into concentration camps. Church groups that were organized to give aid to the starving were disbanded, and their resources seized for the state to disperse goods to the poor as they saw fit. Anyone who resisted was arrested. This war on religion raged across Russia. As Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn would write, later as the manic efforts to eradicate Christianity gathered pace throughout the 20s and 30s, the Soviet regime began the mass arrest of ordinary Orthodox believers. Monks and nuns whose black habits had been a distinctive feature of old Russian life were intensely rounded up on every hand, placed under arrest, and sent into exile. They arrested and sentenced active laymen. The circles kept getting bigger as they raked in ordinary believers as well. Old people, and particularly women, who were the most stubborn believers of all, and who, for many long years to come, would be called nuns in transit prisons and camps. But biographer Joseph Pearce points out, quote, "The grim irony of the situation was that religious faith, technically speaking, was still not a crime. The crime was in mentioning it. In the 20s, for instance, the religious education of children was classified as a political offense. All persons convicted received 10-year sentences, the longest term then given. The absurdity beggars belief. A person was allowed by law to be convinced that he possessed spiritual truth, but was required on pain of imprisonment to conceal the fact from everyone else, even his own children." But it became apparent pretty quickly that Lenin's policies were crippling Russia, ushering in famine since they took the land from the only farmers who were growing surplus, and there was no motivation for tenant farmers whose increase would only be taken by the state. Seeing that this was a problem, Lenin implemented softer measures, allowing more individual property and having less arrests. But Lenin barely lived long enough to see his new economic program go into effect. He had a stroke in 1922 and died in 1924. On his deathbed, Lenin expressed concern that Joseph Stalin might become his successor. For years, he'd been using Stalin to perform tasks that required the most ruthless methods, and he suddenly feared what Stalin might do if he took power. But despite Lenin's warnings, Joseph Stalin systematically removed all of his competitors and gained control of the Soviet Union. Stalin's philosophy is best summarized by his own words: to choose one's victim, to prepare one's plans minutely, to stake an implacable vengeance and then to go to bed. There is nothing sweeter in the world. Stalin wanted to succeed where he felt that Lenin had failed to fully communize Russia. He implemented something called the First Five-Year Plan, which aimed at wiping out the businessmen and peasant farmers who had begun to prosper under Lenin's new economic plan. Another wave of confiscating property followed, as well as greater fervor in the government's fight against religion. Churches and other cathedrals were transformed into secular buildings. Sunday was abolished as a day of worship. Even selling Christmas trees was a crime. The secret police began executing masses who resisted. As Skousen recounts, official reports tell how rebellious villages were leveled to the ground by artillery fire, and in one area of the Don region, 50,000 men, women, and children were destroyed, leaving vestige of only 2,000 people who were shipped off to Central Asia, while the land which they had cultivated for generations was taken over for collectivized farming. As Solzhenitsyn's friend Dmitry Panin wrote, a huge country, basically Christian, had been made over into a nursery for rearing a new breed of men under conditions of wide-scale terror and atheism. A new society governed by primitives began taking shape. Without asking the consent of the peasants or anyone else, the party heads, to achieve their own ends, unleashed their thugs over our vast land and fettered it in slavery. The young communist state proceeded to mutilate and crush whatever opposed it, secular or sacred, to bury human lives under atrocities. But all of this took place when Solzhenitsyn was very young, and compared to many other children of his age, he fared this period in Russia quite well. Millions of children were left orphaned and homeless. Malcolm Muggeridge, working for the Soviet Union as the Guardian's Moscow correspondent, recorded that these children were, quote, going about in packs, barely articulate or recognizably human, with pinched animal faces, tangled hair, and empty eyes. I saw them in Moscow and in Leningrad, clustered under bridges, lurking in railway stations, suddenly emerging like a pack of wild monkeys, then scattering and disappearing. Sadly, many of these children turned to criminal activities to survive. But by the time Solzhenitsyn was 6, things had calmed down a lot. The orphans were swept away into children's republics, or labor communes, which were state institutions where they'd be indoctrinated into Marxist ideology. Now, I can't emphasize this enough, that the communist education system really was a key for recreating the nation. They worked to replace family loyalties to loyalty to the state above all else. Something else that they did in the schooling system was to rewrite history with a Marxist slant, where they glorified the revolution and vilified religion and capitalism. They painted revolutionaries like Lenin as modern-day Robin Hoods, taking from the rich to give to the poor. And they had immense success in doing this. Solzhenitsyn himself excelled in school, finding a special love for literature. But more and more, the atheist, Marxist education that he was receiving clashed with the religious training he got at home. And at least for a time, the education won out. By the time Solzhenitsyn was 17, he was a full-fledged Marxist, and had dreams of writing a novel depicting the complete triumph of the revolution on a global scale. Despite the fact that Solzhenitsyn would witness several arrests, he still grew up somewhat naive about the real state of his country. Explaining this, he said, I had spent my childhood in queues for bread, for milk, for meal. Meat was a thing unknown at the time. But I could not make the connection between the lack of bread and the ruin of the countryside, or understand why it had happened. We were provided with another formula: temporary difficulties. Every night in the large town where we lived, hour after hour after hour, people were being hauled off to jail. But I did not walk the streets at night, and in the daytime the families of those arrested hung out no black flags, nor did my classmates say a word about their fathers being taken away. According to the newspapers, there wasn't a cloud in the sky, and young men are so eager to believe that all is well. When Solzhenitsyn had reached manhood, he had completely abandoned the religious teachings of his childhood, concluding that the confusion and fear his family had experienced following the revolution had merely been them clinging to old and outdated beliefs. Solzhenitsyn said, the party had become our father, and we, the children, obeyed. So when I was leaving school and embarking on my time at university, I made a choice. I banished all my memories, all my childhood misgivings. I was a communist. The world would be what we made it. But the frequent arrests and widespread fear were ever-present witnesses that Marx's ideas had not created a utopia, but a nightmare. Stalin had instituted his own reign of terror. During Solzhenitsyn's last year at the university, some senior students and some of the professors disappeared. In Leningrad alone, during the spring of 1935, somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people were arrested. As Pearce explained, at the height of the terror, it seemed that almost anyone could be arrested at any time. Neighbors were encouraged to report on each other. One young man held up as a hero for turning in his own father. But Solzhenitsyn rationalized all of this as a temporary but necessary step for the cleansing of Russia and the ushering in of communist peace. Later, Solzhenitsyn would look back and say derisively, "We had no sense of living in the midst of a plague, that people were dropping all around us, that a plague was in progress. It's amazing, but we didn't realize it." When World War II broke out and Russia entered the war, Solzhenitsyn was newly married and had just received his degree, but as a model citizen, he rushed to enlist. He would rise to the rank of captain before an ill-conceived criticism of Joseph Stalin would get him sentenced to 8 years in the Gulag, the Russian prison system, and that experience would change the course of his life. Aleksandr lay very still, even the smallest movements causing him pain. The surgical ward of the camp hospital was less crowded than usual, and relatively quiet, as many patients had already drifted off to sleep. The overhead light had been switched off to spare his eyes, leaving him only a faint glow by which to see the room. Aleksandr lay awake, hot and feverish. Despite his recovering condition, his mind was alert, and he sat lost in thought. Cancer. To think that he had survived 8 years in the Gulag, undergoing every form of suffering imaginable. Intense manual labor, while icy wind sliced at him like daggers. Watching many of his fellow prisoners freeze to death before finishing their work. The severe hunger, sleep deprivation, and the degrading conditions and filth. To have survived all of that, and at the very end be laid down with cancer, seemed deeply ironic. The 2 weeks he'd waited for the surgery needed to remove the tumor had been a time of deep reflection. Life was so grossly unfair. He'd lost everything when he'd become a prisoner. And yet, strangely, there was something he'd gained. A new perspective. He thought of the time that he'd been transferred from the New Jerusalem prison camp, so named for the monastery it had once been, where he'd experienced his first taste of bitter forced labor. The months he'd spent there had been so miserable that they'd redefined suffering for him. Having not been very physically active before his imprisonment, he'd found his body quite unsuited to the labor. His work partner in the New Jerusalem pits had been Boris Gamarov, a young Russian dissident with a pale yellowish face. Feeble and anemic looking as he was, Aleksandr soon discovered that the 22-year-old's spiritual stature belied his physical frailty. Aleksandr well recalled one of their first conversations. They had almost immediately launched into a discussion about politics. Recalling a prayer from the recently deceased American president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, published in one of the Soviet newspapers, Aleksandr concluded, "Well, that's hypocrisy, of course." But to his surprise, Gamarov frowned, asking, "Why? Why do you not admit the possibility that a political leader might sincerely believe in God?" Taken aback, Aleksandr just stared at him. Had such a comment come from someone of their parents' generation, he could have dismissed it as the touting of principles long dead and gone. But Gamarov was 4 years younger than Aleksandr himself. He hadn't even been born when the revolution had taken place, sweeping aside religion as superstitious nonsense. For once, Aleksandr was at a loss for a response. Finally, he simply asked, "Do you believe in God?" "Of course," came the calm reply. Aleksandr had never forgotten the power of that simple response. He'd had similar experiences with other prisoners, amazed at how the Christian prisoners seemed to handle their suffering with much more grace and dignity. Unfortunately, Gamarov didn't survive his first winter at the camps, dying from tuberculosis and exhaustion, but his memory remained. Now Aleksandr himself was faced with death, yet in the strange Christian paradox of losing your life to find it, he felt that by facing death, he had gained a much clearer understanding of life. And as his body healed, he felt that his soul was healing also. Aleksandr heard a shuffle near the door and turned to see a man enter the infirmary. In the dim light, he still recognized Dr. Boris Kornfeld. The doctor strode past the rows of narrow iron beds to where Aleksandr lay, pulling up a chair next to his bed. Kornfeld was not responsible for his care, but seemed to have found in Aleksandr a listening ear, and Aleksandr appreciated the company. Kornfeld was a prisoner himself, having also been arrested during the Stalinist purges, but because he was a trained physician, he was assigned to work in the camp hospital instead of hard labor. They did not know each other well. Kornfeld kept mostly to himself, locking himself away in the hospital barracks, but he seemed to be a gentle, well-mannered person. Hardly able to move, Aleksandr mostly listened to Kornfeld speak about his history, how he was raised as a Jew, but was a recent convert to Christianity. Originally, Kornfeld had been very bitter about his unjust imprisonment, but had eventually found God in his suffering, having been converted by the testimony of another prisoner. Aleksandr could hardly see Kornfeld's face, the scattered reflections of the perimeter outside, the only source of light. But there was such a mystical quality and conviction in his voice that Aleksandr felt a shudder run through him. Finally, Kornfeld concluded, "And on the whole, I have become convinced that there is no punishment that comes to us in this life on earth which is undeserved. Superficially, it can have nothing to do with what we are guilty of in actual fact. But if you go over your life with a fine-tooth comb and ponder it deeply, you will always be able to hunt down that transgression of yours for which you have now received this blow." When Kornfeld left, moving to one of the nearby wards to sleep, Aleksandr continued to think about his words. He was deeply moved by Kornfeld's testimony. Aleksandr had come to many of the same conclusions himself. In fact, he had developed many of those ideas even further. He agreed with Kornfeld to a point. He couldn't accept fully that all suffering was just. With all the terrible inhumanity he had witnessed, was he to believe that all imprisoned people in the Gulag were merely getting their just due? Did that mean that people with comparatively easier lives were better? Or, most difficult of all to accept, did that mean the criminals of the world, the inflictors of pain, were better than their victims? Were the guards who tormented them, or even Stalin himself, less evil than those they trampled upon? Why does fate not punish them? Aleksandr wondered. Why do they prosper? There was only one answer that made sense. If the meaning of earthly existence, the very purpose of life, was not to prosper, but rather to develop the soul, in which case their torturers had been punished more terribly than themselves, for they had lost their humanity, they had damaged their own souls. For had not his experience, Aleksandr pondered, changed him irrevocably, awakened him to the truth, and ultimately to God? The next morning, Aleksandr was awoken by the sound of running about and tramping in the corridor. Confused, he rubbed the sleep from his eyes. He was horrified to discover that during the night, Dr. Kornfeld had been dealt 8 blows to the skull, killed by an unknown hand in his sleep. Crime and death were certainly not uncommon in the Gulag, But Kornfeld's sudden passing added further weight to his testimony. Those prophetic words were the last Kornfeld ever spoke on Earth, and they felt to Aleksandr like a kind of inheritance, one he could not take lightly. As the following days passed, and Aleksandr continued to recover, he pondered deeply over his life and the unexpected turns it had taken. He spent sleepless nights thinking over his experiences. It seemed as if for the first time he was fully awake, fully alive in his understanding. All the doubts and shadows seemed to disappear, and he viewed the world with resolve and clarity. He began slowly writing down his feelings in the form of a poem. Finishing the last 2 stanzas, he wrote, "I gaze through new eyes at the life I once followed, and gazing, I shudder with thanks. It was not my own intellect, not my desiring, that illuminated each twist in my path, but the still, even light of a higher design, that only with time I could grasp. And now, as I sip with newfound moderation from the life-giving waters, I see that my faith is restored. O Lord of creation, I renounced you, but you stood by me." Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn would look back on his close brush with death in the Gulag cancer ward as one of the most defining moments of his life. He said, "When at the end of jail, on top of everything else, I was placed with cancer, then I was fully cleansed and came back to a deep awareness of God and a deep understanding of life. From that time, I was formed essentially into who I am now." The once hardened Marxist emerged from his time as a prisoner of war with a deep faith in God. Solzhenitsyn rubbed shoulders with countless other victims of the Soviet regime, and he learned many of their stories. Carefully, he began storing them away in his memory, for he had come to another important conclusion during his time as a prisoner, that one day he would write something to expose the full truth, to shine a light on the darkness beneath Soviet society. He would write down his thoughts on scraps of paper, burning them once he'd committed them to memory, for he knew that if they were discovered, he would surely receive a further sentence. Then finally, on February 14th, 1953, Solzhenitsyn was led out of the prison gates. But as was common with political prisoners, even after his prison sentence was complete, he was assigned to perpetual internal exile, meaning that he, along with other released prisoners, were sent to a remote region of Russia, where they experienced limited freedom and ongoing suspicion. But to Solzhenitsyn, the new liberty was intoxicating, and 3 days after his arrival in Kazakhstan, news reached the village that Joseph Stalin had died. Now, Soviet propaganda had painted Joseph Stalin as the father of the nation, who had helped to defeat Germany during World War II, and so there were many who genuinely mourned his death. Others pretended to mourn, but those like Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn felt no such emotion. He said, "This was the moment my friends and I had looked forward to, the moment for which every Zek in Gulag, except the Orthodox communists, had prayed. He's dead. The Asiatic dictator is dead. The villain has curled up and died. What unconcealed rejoicing there would be back home in the special camp. But where I was, Russian girls, school teachers, stood sobbing their hearts out. They had lost a beloved parent. I could have howled with joy there by the loudspeaker. I could even have danced a wild jig. But alas, the rivers of history flow slowly. My face, trained to meet all occasions, assumed a frown of mournful attention. For the present, I must pretend. Go on pretending as before." Now, some of you listening might think that seems kind of cold, but keep in mind that Stalin is estimated to have a direct hand in the deaths of somewhere between 6 and 20 million of his own people, and about 18 million passed through the Gulag prison system. In fact, the concentration camps and the labor that was performed by the prisoners became a huge part of the Russian economic system. And it was not just regular Soviet citizens that were targeted by this regime. Stalin personally signed warrants for at least 44,000 high-ranking individuals. He wiped out nearly all the original Bolsheviks who fought alongside Lenin, and decimated his own officer corps. Oftentimes the very men who carried out the killings in the secret police were the next victims. In the period of history beginning with the Bolshevik Revolution all the way to the collapse of the Soviet Union, some historians estimate that up to 60 million people died. That's actually the number that Solzhenitsyn would also give us. We often point to Hitler and the Holocaust as the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. And while that is absolutely horrendous, and it should not be ignored, the fact is, communism cost far more lives than Nazism during this period of history. Just in Russia alone, it was about 10 times the amount. And that's not even taking into consideration everything that happened in China under Mao Zedong, where about 100 million people died. The fact that these things are not taught in schools today is just an absolute testament to how corrupt our education system is. These were some of the most important events of the 20th century. And maybe if we understood them better, we would not be embracing communism the way we have. The whole experiment of communism is a cautionary tale, to say the least. And the David that God would raise up to slay this Goliath, referring to the Soviet Union, was not a military leader, he was a writer. During his time in exile, Solzhenitsyn secretly wrote, careful to conceal his work. And as power dynamics changed in Russia, with Nikita Khrushchev becoming Stalin's successor, Khrushchev began the process of de-Stalinization, meaning he was trying to get away from Stalin's old policies. And during this time, many political crimes were investigated, including Solzhenitsyn's. And the charges against him were actually dropped. It was a decade too late. He'd already spent 8 years paying for that sentence, not to mention the 3 years he would be in exile. So this allowed Solzhenitsyn to finally come home. As Pearce explained it, quote, little did the chief military prosecutor know it, but he had plucked this ticking time bomb from the relative safety of a village in Kazakhstan and placed it carefully at the heart of Soviet society. Solzhenitsyn, strengthened and purified by his time in prison and exile, was primed and ready to explode on an unsuspecting literary world. But as it was, Solzhenitsyn continued to write secretly, adding to his growing pile of manuscripts. He began to be convinced that nothing he wrote would ever be published during his lifetime. But as the cultural climate in Russia continued to shift, he cautiously decided to share his work, knowing that it was still risky and might lead to the loss of his manuscripts and possibly his own death or imprisonment. He sent his novel One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich into a potential publisher. The book showcased what a single day in the life of a labor camp prisoner looked like. But with media censorship still in place, the book ended up going right to the top, to Khrushchev himself, who, as he was currently working to de-Stalinize, approved it. When the book was finally published, it was an instant success. For those who had experienced the camps, they were amazed at how Solzhenitsyn had captured their experience with such accuracy. Others, who were blissfully ignorant, were broadsided by the descriptions of the camps. One woman, whose husband had died in the gulag, wrote to Solzhenitsyn, I hear this crowd of hungry, freezing creatures, half people, half animals, and amongst them is my husband. Continue to write the truth, even though they won't print it now. Our floods of tears were not shed in vain. The truth will rise to the surface in this river of tears. Solzhenitsyn had several other books published, but his friendly relations with the new regime was brief. As power changed to new hands, Solzhenitsyn went from being a brief hero to an enemy once again. He had to work with the greatest caution, hiding his manuscripts with trusted friends, and he expected arrest at any moment. Were it not for the fact that the new regime was trying to present themselves as more humane than the previous leadership, and that Solzhenitsyn was now a famous writer that would only be turned into a martyr if they killed him, they probably would have done just that. But they were still very intent on silencing him. They blocked him from publication and had him under KGB surveillance. Despite this, Solzhenitsyn continued to write, compiling previous prisoners' experiences for what would be one of his greatest books, the Gulag Archipelago. Archipelago literally means a string of islands, so he was referring to this vast collection of prison camps in Russia. In this book, he would take all of these collective experiences and tell the history of the Gulag. Essentially, he was ripping away the wool and showing the ravenous wolf underneath the Soviet society. But as Russia was rejecting him, Solzhenitsyn's books began to take off in Europe and in America. The free world was referred to as the West, the communist world, the East. So when I say the West, I'm referring to places like Europe and America. And when Solzhenitsyn finally finished the Gulag Archipelago, and it got published in the West, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. The Soviet Union stripped Solzhenitsyn of his citizenship and exiled him. This was initially very devastating for Solzhenitsyn, who loved his country. But his writing did become easier without the constant trouble and fear from authorities. After spending some time in Switzerland, he eventually moved to America in 1976, where he would spend about 18 years of his life. But people soon discovered that Solzhenitsyn was as quick to criticize the West as he was the East. The sky was gray, the clouds drizzling rain over Harvard University. Scores of umbrellas covered the heads of the waiting crowd, somewhere between 10 to 15,000 in number. Aleksandr looked out over the massive gathering, his fingers lightly tapping on his knee. A representative from the college, a woman with short dark hair and glasses, rose to introduce him as the commemorative speaker. Though he'd been living in America several years now, he still did not speak English fluently, and only caught bits and pieces of what she said. He had come to appreciate America, this place that had welcomed him and his family. He'd gained the reputation of a recluse, content with his family and his writing. He and Natalia had done their best to raise their 3 sons with an understanding of their Russian heritage, even as they attended American schools and learned American culture and language. Aleksandr heard his name as the woman introducing him concluded her remarks. The crowd applauded, and Aleksandr grabbed his written speech, moving toward the mic. He nodded and smiled to the crowd, the sound of an airplane buzzing overhead. He knew that what he was about to say was likely not what the listening crowd expected. Clearing his throat, he began, "I am sincerely happy to be here on the occasion of the 327th commencement of this old and most prestigious university." He spoke the words in Russian, and they were echoed back by the translator in English. Aleksandr congratulated the graduates, then pointed out that Harvard's motto is Veritas, or truth. Truth is seldom sweet, he warned the crowd. It is almost invariably bitter. A measure of bitter truth is included in my speech today, but I offer it as a friend, not as an adversary. He pointed to the great dividing split in the world, the East championing communism and the West capitalism. But he said, "The truth is that the split is more profound and more alienating, that the rifts are more numerous than one can see at first glance." Were he speaking to an Eastern audience, he would have addressed the problems plaguing them. But as it was, he felt compelled to discuss the issues faced by Western societies. He began laying out how morally bankrupt the West, including the United States, had become. Their materialistic prosperity was robbing them of courage and the values that built them up in the first place. They had removed the responsibilities associated with freedom. It is time in the West, he explained, to defend not so much human rights as human obligations. Applause followed the words. Pressing forward, he pointed to the misuse of liberty, evidenced by motion pictures full of pornography, crime, and horror. These things stood as a testament to the West's inability to defend itself against this corrosive evil. Materialism was sucking the soul out of the West, as men began to worship things, placing himself and his own happiness above all else. Aleksandr began to explain the philosophy of sacrifice and self-limitation that he had discovered as a prisoner in the labor camps. If, as acclaimed by humanism, he began, men were born only to be happy, he would not be born to die. Since his body is doomed to death, his task on earth evidently must be more spiritual. Not a total engrossment in everyday life, not the search for the best ways to obtain material goods and then their carefree consumption. It has to be the fulfillment of a permanent, earnest duty so that one's life journey may become above all an experience of moral growth. To leave life a better human being than one started it. Aleksandr went on to explain how humanism, or a godless view of man's progress, was destroying the West. He explained, "It has made man the measure of all things on earth, imperfect man, who is never free of pride, self-interest, envy, vanity, and dozens of other defects." He explained that in losing the concept of God, the West had lost its restraint and its responsibility. "We have placed too much hope in politics," he said, "and social reforms, only to find out that we are being deprived of our most precious possession, our spiritual life. It is trampled by the party mob in the East, by the commercial one in the West. This is the essence of the crisis. The split in the world is less terrifying than the similarity of the disease afflicting its main sectors." Aleksandr hoped his audience could see that both the vices found in the West and those found in the East would ultimately lead to the same place, if not tempered by virtue and religion. He spoke for nearly an hour. Finishing up his thoughts, he said, "If the world has not approached its end, it has reached a major watershed in history, equal in importance to the turn from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. It will demand from us a spiritual blaze. We shall have to rise to a new height of vision, to a new level of life, where our physical nature will not be cursed, as in the Middle Ages. But even more importantly, our spiritual being will not be trampled upon, as in the modern era. This ascension is similar to climbing onto the next anthropological stage. No one on earth has any other way left but upward." Applause followed his closing remarks, and Aleksandr placed a hand over his heart, offering a gracious bow to the crowd, who rose to their feet, still clapping their hands. Aleksandr knew he'd spoken bluntly, but one could not put a price on truth. Though applauded during his speech at Harvard, Solzhenitsyn's address sparked controversy across America, with newspapers claiming that Solzhenitsyn didn't comprehend the American way of life or its values. But he did comprehend it, perhaps better than America understood itself. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn has been viewed by many almost as a prophetic figure, partly because of his keen insights and his constant calls to national repentance, but it was also because of his ability to stir controversy. I'm sure when he was invited to give that address at Harvard, people were expecting him to extol American virtues, not to be reprimanded for their declining values. You see, he was teaching the American people something very important. Sometimes we get into this mentality of communism bad, capitalism good. But there are some very soul-destructive ways to live in capitalism. If the prosperity drives us away from God and causes us to mistreat our neighbor, then it can be a very bad thing. As Pearce wrote, although the West had not suffered the communist experience, it too was experiencing a drying up of religious consciousness. The concepts of good and evil have been ridiculed for several centuries. Banished from common use, they have been replaced by political or class considerations of short-lived value. It has become embarrassing to appeal to eternal concepts, embarrassing to state that evil makes its home in the individual human heart before it enters a political system. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn further explained, communist propaganda would sometimes include statements such as, "We include all the commandments of the gospel in our ideology." The difference is that the gospel asks all this to be achieved through love, through self-limitation, but socialism only uses coercion. Yet if Bolshevism was a bully, capitalism was a cad. Whereas the former crushed the human spirit, the latter corrupted it with comforts, and as such was equally insidious. Solzhenitsyn would quote from Pope John Paul II, who said, "I would summarize as follows: untouched by the breath of God, unrestricted by human conscience, both capitalism and socialism are repulsive." Now please don't misunderstand me. I am all for capitalism. I am all for freedom and a free market. But we have to live well in capitalism. People begin to think that freedom in and of itself is a good thing. But the point isn't to be free. It's to be free to choose good. This is why the American Founding Fathers stressed virtue and religion so much. Because without it, freedom just becomes chaos. A society cannot function if it is completely unrestrained. Capitalism doesn't make people good. It gives people the opportunity to be good. If people begin using their freedom to do terrible things, embracing immorality, violence, and greed, then we will ultimately destroy ourselves. Solzhenitsyn gave his own definition of freedom. He said, after the Western ideal of unlimited freedom, after the Marxist concept of freedom as acceptance of the yoke of necessity, here is the true Christian definition of freedom. Freedom is self-restriction. Restriction of the self for the sake of others. Explaining what he believed brought about the horrors in Russia, Solzhenitsyn said, over half a century ago, while I was still a child, I recall hearing a number of older people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why all of this has happened. Since then, he explained, he had spent nearly half a century researching the history of the Russian Revolution, which had, quote, swallowed up some 60 million of our people. But if he was asked to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of all that had happened, he could not put it more accurately than to repeat the same words. And if I were called upon to identify briefly the principal trait of the entire 20th century, here too, I would be unable to find anything more precise and pithy than to repeat once again, men have forgotten God. We see a lot of activists today who are deeply scripted in Marxist ideologies, many of whom don't even realize it. These are people who see the world divided into oppressors and oppressed, who place man and his own happiness at the center of the universe, who seek to destroy the family unit, and are trying to change the world through the social systems. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't a place for activism, but the problem is that it so often ignores the greatest force for change in the world. The difference between the Marxist and the Christian is that the Christian recognizes that all of society's problems have spiritual roots, and therefore can only be fixed by spiritual solutions. Any godless approach to fixing a nation, whether it's through communism or even capitalism, will fall short, because the ills that plague mankind are ultimately of a spiritual nature. Why is it that here in America we are experiencing some of the greatest prosperity in all the history of the world, but depression rates are skyrocketing? Because, as Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn stated it, our life consists not in the pursuit of material success, but in the quest for worthy spiritual growth. Our entire earthly existence is but a transitional stage in the movement towards something higher. Material laws alone do not explain our life or give it direction. The laws of physics and physiology will never reveal the indisputable manner in which the Creator constantly, day in and day out, participates in the life of each of us, unfailingly granting us the energy of existence. When this assistance leaves us, we die. In the life of our entire planet, the divine spirit moves with no less force. This we must grasp in our dark and terrible hour. I believe that God raises people up to be warning voices to the world. Solzhenitsyn would eventually return to his beloved Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. His books played a large role in exposing the evils of the communist regime, and ultimately helped to bring about its downfall. As Russia moved away from communism, Solzhenitsyn continued preaching his same message of Christianity, morals, and avoiding materialism. Unfortunately, he would largely go unheeded. But his words still cry to us, calling us to repent, to return to God. There is a message that emerges from under the rubble of the fallen Soviet Union, a warning. The fruits of that ideology are evidenced by the millions who became its victims. Perhaps Jordan Peterson put it best when he said, "If there was any excuse to be a Marxist in 1917, there is absolutely and finally no excuse now." And we know that mostly because of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn and the Gulag Archipelago. Thank heaven for that great author's outrage, courage, and unquenchable thirst for justice and truth. It was Solzhenitsyn who warned us that the catastrophes of the Soviet state were inexorably and causally linked to the deceitful blandishments of the Marxist utopian vision. It was Solzhenitsyn who documented the price paid in suffering for the dreadful communist experiment, and who distilled from that suffering the wisdom we must all heed, so that such catastrophe does not visit us again. I hope we learn the lessons of the past, that we heed the warnings we have been given, because that is the spiritual blaze that Solzhenitsyn called for, the kind that saves a nation and ignites our faith. I just wanted to say thank you to those who have reached out to me over the fan mail feature. Sadly, it doesn't allow me to respond, but please know that I read and appreciate the messages so much. Also, I am going to be helping lead an American history tour on the East Coast this summer, so if you'd be interested in joining me and seeing some of these places that I discuss on the podcast, I'll put a link to that in the description.